All right. For next time, you're going to be reading Mary Shelley's short story, The Mortal Immortal. That'll be it. So let's start where we usually do on Monday. We'll just quickly go over the vocab terms from last week, and then we'll get into talking about these. Okay. What is the Lake District?
It's where the Wordsworth house was. It's a bit picturesque.
Yeah, William and Dorothy Wordsworth lived there, so did Coleridge, so did Robert Southey. It's a region in Cumbria in northwestern England, right? Which is well known for its natural beauty, hence Lake District. It was a kind of gathering point for the early generation of British Romantic poets. All right, the wedding guest. Who or what is the wedding guest?
He was the guest that got pulled aside by the mariner before he went into the wedding celebration. They got told the story.
Yep, the poor sap who was forced to listen to the mariner's story in the Rhyme of the Ancient Mariner, right? Yep, exactly. And a sadder and a wiser man, he awakens the next morning. So the only real effect that the mariner story has on him is to bum him the hell out. Okay, y'all remember what pantasocracy was? This has to do with Coleridge's politics, at least in his youthful politics.
An egalitarian commune.
Yeah, he and Robert Southey were going to move to Pennsylvania and found an egalitarian commune on the banks of the Susquehanna River, right? This project never got off the ground, but this kind of notion of human equality and community is something that is still kind of present in the Rhyme of the Ancient Mariner. All right, Dove Cottage, Grasmere. What is Dove Cottage?
It's where the Wordsworth lived for about 8 years.
Yep, this is
And it was in the Lake District.
Yes, this is the specific house in the Lake District in the village of Grasmere where William and Dorothy Wordsworth and their brother John lived. All right, a ballad. What is a ballad?
Change my mind. I don't want to answer. I can tell you what a lyrical ballad is.
Okay, that's a start, right? And we'll go from there.
Are you okay? A short non-narrative intended to convey an idea or emotion.
Okay, yeah, so that's a lyric, right?
Yes.
A lyric is intended to convey an idea or emotion,
Full
right?
form,
Yep,
orally transmitted, and there's many versions.
yep.
And it's 4 lines, A, B, C, D. That's the stanza.
Yep, that is correct. It tells a story, and it usually kind of only gives you the climax of the story, right? And yeah, the Rhyme of the Ancient Mariner is written in ballad stanzas. All right, Inventive Tradition. What's an inventive tradition? this idea is probably going to be relevant today as well.
Is it just a tradition that's created?
Revived.
Yeah, I kind of like combine your two answers here, right? So it's actually, it's something that's actually an innovation, or it's a new idea, but it's presented as though it's something older, as though it's a revival of an older idea, right? So for example, the way, like a lot of what Coleridge and Wordsworth are doing in lyrical ballads, right, is they're actually creating these kind of new poetic forms, but by doing things like using like archaic language and grammar in Coleridge's rhyme, right? They're trying to make it look old-fashioned, right? They're trying to make it look like a kind of revival of some other historical tradition, when it's really something entirely different. All right, vocational philanthropy. Y'all remember what vocational philanthropy is?
Work out of like love for their families and stuff.
Yeah.
Women's work.
Yeah, and think of like Dorothy Wordsworth, making William's vest and cleaning up his crap, right? And not having the heart to throw his apple core into the fire, right? Like cutting his pens for him and taking dictation for him, right? All of this work that is not, she's not getting paid for it. It's not the labor that supports the family, but it's supposed to be like a kind of like a labor of love or like a kind of cause, right? And yeah, this is something that was particularly expected of middle class women. Good. All right. William Wordsworth's wedding ring. Someone tell me the tale of William Wordsworth's wedding ring.
Well, Dorothy wore it to bed all night, and then he took it from her in the morning, and then after she heard news to get married to Mary Hutchinson. She heard news that he got married. She ran to her room and was so upset.
Yeah. So it's kind of emblematic of this really kind of strange brother-sister relationship, right? And of Dorothy's fears of being displaced in the house by her new sister-in-law. All right. What is an albatross, or the albatross, more properly?
Was the good omen bird that
Mm-hmm.
was killed?
Yes.
What was his name?
Yes. He doesn't really have one, right? He's the ancient mariner.
Right. Okay.
But yeah, he's never really named in the poem. So yeah, the albatross is the bird. Yes, the bird of good omen that the ancient mariner kills. Do either of you know what an albatross looks like? Have you ever seen one?
I'm thinking like a bird in my head. I'm just imagining like a Harry Potter, like Hagrid's bird. What was its name?
Like what?
Prisoner of Azkaban.
Buckbeak, the hippogriff thing.
Yeah, I don't know. That in my head, I was reading it and I saw Buckbeak.
They're not that big and they don't have 4 legs. But yeah, no, so an albatross, like it kind of looks like a seagull with enormous wings. So they're these birds that are incredibly graceful in the air, but really, really clumsy on land.
Are they real?
Oh yeah, they are real. Albatrosses do exist. All right, Christmas Day, 1802.
It was Dorothy's birthday, her 31st birthday. She described it. It was very short.
Yeah.
It described her life. It was sad and cold and dreary.
It is a dull, cold, dark day. Yeah, and I'm 31 years old today, and it sucks. Right? Yeah, so yeah, I know. It's Christmas. It's her birthday, and all she can say about it is it's a dull, cold, dark day. All right, good. So let's get into the Keats poem then. So by way of brief introduction to this, I actually want to talk a little bit about the tradition that the holiday we celebrate today with little cards with bare-bottom cupids and boxes of candy and shit is based on. Have either of you ever heard of Lupercalia?
I have heard of it, and I have been told what it is, but I cannot tell you what it is now.
Am I the one who told you what it is?
Probably.
Okay. Yep, I usually go through this
Probably
with
last year.
yeah, I usually go through this with my spring semester classes. Yeah, like just because like I one of the things I love about humanity is just how insanely weird as a species we are, right? And just like the bizarre justifications we come up with for doing very strange things. And then how those very strange things that we used to do morph into new things that would look bizarre to the people who used to do the old thing. All right, so Lupercalia was the ancient Roman festival of the wolf. So the myth of the founding of Rome was that these two twin brothers, Romulus and Remus, who had been raised in the wild by a she-wolf, were the founders of the city, right? And they were actually the sons of the war god Mars and so on and so forth. Like kind of the usual civilization founder myth, right? Demigods with an unusual background. So it was intended to celebrate that she-wolf who raised the legendary founders. And the way this holiday was celebrated, young Roman aristocratic men would run around naked in the streets, slapping women with wolfskins, which was intended to ensure their fertility in the coming year. So, once Rome is Christianized, this doesn't look quite so socially acceptable. Like social norms change, social conventions change, and people are a lot less willing to accept people who run around in the streets with no pants on. So this kind of becomes a holiday dedicated to a probably invented saint. There probably was no Saint Valentine. He may have been based on a number of other different figures. But yeah, so the story becomes that he is one who married Christians in secret, right? And that then the holiday is to commemorate him and his martyrdom. I guess the story is that the Romans caught him and did what they usually do with captured criminals. But so we have here a holiday that kind of evolves from pagan fertility festival into Christian celebration of married love into commercial exploitation of human romantic impulses. Right now, it's pretty much all about buying shit. But believe me, I laid out a good bit of cash on this myself this year, so I'm well aware. So I think that this actually kind of relates to the Eve of St. Agnes in a couple of ways, right? Like on the one hand, we've got a poem that is looking back on a medieval past, right? And kind of reading early 19th century romantic ideas, small r romantic and capital R romantic, onto this medieval story, right? So, what'd y'all think of this poem? How'd it go for you?
I liked it.
Okay.
I thought it was good.
Okay. What'd you like about it?
I don't know the story behind it, like how they had to do offerings and how they didn't eat dinner before they
Uh-huh.
went to bed, or else it wouldn't work.
Yeah, there's this kind of weird ritual procedure, right, that Madeline has to go through. So the legend here, right, so we're able to pick up on what the elements of the legend here are on St. Agnes Eve. what is Madeline trying to do by, say like saying her prayers in a particular way and, fasting?
She's trying to like get like some like love. I think she's trying to make sure that she will have a love.
Yeah, the purpose of the ritual is for a young woman to get a glimpse of her future husband, right? So St. Agnes, in particular, is the patron saint of virgins. And is associated with lambs. So these, like the various references to sheep in the poem, are not accidental, right? This is to do with one of the attributes of the saint, right? She's always pictured, carrying a lamb as a kind of symbol of innocence. And the lambs that are shorn of their wool on St. Agnes Day, like that wool is then made into like the robes that the Pope wears. So do with that what you will. But okay, so what's the basic story? So this is the kind of the little ritual that Madeline is performing here, right? What's the thrust of the story here? What's the narrative?
It kind of like one of the stories with like the first layer, and then it kind of like dips into like the party scene. There's different music now. Because at first it's the Beadsman.
Yeah. Yeah, we start with this guy, the Beadsman. And then we move from him to this family party. Which Madeline leaves early, right? And then what happens after Madeline leaves the party?
What is his name?
I don't know how to say it.
Yeah, her lover Porphyro sneaks into the castle, right?
And asks, I don't know if it was one of her nurses or her servants to sneak him in her room so he can see her.
Yes. This old woman, Angela, helps him sneak into Madeline's room. Right, she's expecting to have this dream in which she'll see her future husband, and instead she wakes up and, oh hey, here's Porphyro, he's been hiding in my closet, right? So I want to get to like what's maybe weird and problematic about some of this as well, but yeah. And then Madeline and Porphyro escape together, right? Did you find this narrative a little easier to follow than the Rime of the Ancient Mariner?
Once it got into the family, like party, yes.
Okay.
Yeah, I was confused. I had to reread the beginning to figure out where the transition from like the Beadsman to that.
Yeah, because the Beadsman isn't obviously connected to the main plot, right? Although we do begin and end with the Beadsman, so he's so the poem, right, like the Rime of the Ancient Mariner, is kind of circular in that way. It brings us back to that point of origin. And I think also that one of the reasons why poems like this give us difficulty, right, is that, I mean, we're not really used to reading narrative poetry anymore, right? narrative that we're accustomed to is, most written narrative anyway, is, in prose form, right? We read novels, we read stories. We don't necessarily read poems that tell a story, right? People don't really write like this anymore. So it can, I think, often feel a little bit remote from our own experience in ways that a short story or an essay might not. But it would also have been actually kind of remote in some ways from the direct experience of a lot of Keats's contemporaries, because like Coleridge, he is going back to an older form and adapting it for his purposes. So he's not using a folk form like Coleridge is. He's using a form that was already going to be used in quote-unquote high art poetry. So the kind of stanza this is written in, right? They're called Spenserian stanzas because they were invented by the Elizabethan poet Edmund Spenser in the late 16th century. So Spenser wrote one of the longest narrative poems in the English language, The Faerie Queen, as a celebration of Elizabeth I. And it was written entirely in stanzas of this shape, right? So what we have in a Spenserian stanza are 9 lines. The first 8 lines are written in what's called pentameter. Now, do y'all know what pentameter means when we're talking about poetry? Okay. So the way poetic meter works, right, the way we measure poetic meter, we don't count in English language poetry the number of syllables in a line. We count the number of what we call feet. And this is derived originally from Greek poetry. So feet will typically be either 2 syllables or 3 syllables, right? So for example, if you've ever heard of iambic pentameter, an iamb is a 2-syllable foot that consists of an unstressed syllable followed by a stressed syllable. Meanwhile, an anapest is a 3-syllable foot that is 2 unstressed syllables followed by a stressed syllable. So like the word today, right, would be an iamb. I'm trying to think of a word that would be an anapest, and I'm failing. All right, I just can't think of an example off the top of my head. But so if we're talking about like a pentameter line, so pentameter means, what, you know what penta means in Greek? Okay, penta means 5. So pentameter means 5 feet, right? Not 5 syllables, 5 feet. So if we are measuring a line in iambic pentameter, how many syllables is it going to have? Remember how many syllables are in an iamb?
7? I'm just, I don't know actually. Okay, so is that 2 syllables in iamb?
Yeah, the iamb is 2
and
syllables.
And then wouldn't you add the iambic pentameter?
So pentameter means 5 feet, right?
So, we're talking syllables?
Yeah, how many syllables then would there be in an iambic pentameter line?
Is it like 2 syllables per foot? So it would be 10.
Exactly, yes. So the first 8 lines in a Spenserian stanza are all in mostly iambic pentameter, right? So there'll be 10 syllables. The 9th line is what's called an Alexandrian. And an Alexandrian is a 12-syllable line. So it's always capped off by a line that is longer and slower than the others. And the rhyme scheme in a Spenserian stanza is as follows. A, B, A, B, B, C, B, C, C. So, whenever you see this pattern now in other poetry, you will recognize what this is, right? This is a Spenserian stanza. Now, the other cue that Keats is taking from Spenser, right? So when Spenser wrote the Faerie Queen, he was doing so in a form and in language that was already old-fashioned by the end of the 16th century, right? So he's reaching back further to kind of late medieval language in the Renaissance, just as Keats is reaching back kind of to Renaissance language and medieval kind of story in the Romantic period. Now, does anybody know why we call the Romantic period Romantic, capital R? We've never actually gotten around to this. Do y'all know what a romance is as a literary genre?
A heroic, like, hero's duty kind of thing.
Yeah.
And there's like always some kind of like love interest in
Uh-huh.
some way.
Yeah. So yeah, think of
hero's journeys.
yeah. So when we think romance here, right? Think like chivalric romance. Think right like these medieval tales of knightly adventure. Right, knightly. And yeah, this is what gives the Romantic period its name. This kind of like idea of reaching backward into an earlier period for form and content, and kind of skipping over the very structured, very contemporary ideas of the neoclassical period that they're developing out of, right? And by the time Keats is doing this, right, so Keats is part of the second generation of British Romantic poets. And one thing that's kind of interesting about this second generation, there are a couple things that are interesting about them. One is that they all die young. So Lord Byron, for example, goes off to Greece to fight in their revolution against the Ottoman Empire and is dead by the age of 36. Percy Shelley, husband of Mary Shelley, dies in a sailing accident at the age of 29. And Keats, who before he was a poet was a medical student, dies of tuberculosis at the age of 25. So with this particular generation of poets, there is a kind of strong kind of notion of like work left unfinished, and a weird kind of particularly in Keats, who knew he was dying for much of the time he was writing poetry. When you had tuberculosis, it was hard not to know you were dying because you felt weak most of the time. You were always coughing up blood. So we see in a lot of Keats's poetry this kind of tension between like permanence and instability, right? And these motionless figures, often kind of captured in the midst of an action that they will never complete. So for example, if we look on page 961 at the chapel in which the beadsman is saying his prayers. Right. Can I get somebody to read for us stanza 2 here? We're starting with his prayer he saith.
His prayer he saith, his patient holy man, and takes his life and risen from his knees, and back returneth neither, barefoot wan, along the chapel side by slow degrees. The sculpture dead on each side seemed to breeze. Imprisoned in black, purgatorial rails, knights, ladies praying in dumb oratories. He passeth by, and his weak spirit fails to think how they may ache in his clothes and nails.
Okay, thank you. So, particularly if we look at the second half of the stanza here, right? What's the image that we get?
The sculptures of the people who are have passed, but he kind of makes it like, even though they're already frozen, like he kind of brings life into them. What was the word for that? Bringing like inanimate objects to life. There's like a specific word. It was in that one, the last, but Mr. Norton.
Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell, yeah. Bringing inanimate objects to life.
Something like that.
I know what you're talking
but
about.
Yeah,
the word is escaping me
human
right now,
emotions
too.
almost like.
Yeah. So
he
yeah,
made them seem cold, and I was like, oh, and then I was like, no, they're already sculptured.
And these are sculptures of human beings, right? But I think on the one hand, there is a kind of life that's given to them, but we also have to take a look at one that are they actually moving? They're sculptures, right? And they're praying in dumb oratories, right? What does dumb mean in this context?
Silent.
Yeah. So is anyone ever going to hear their prayers? And they're stuck in these black purgatorial rails, right? So they're permanently trapped in this kind of between state, right? Like between living and dead, between damned and saved. And the beadsman's job, were we able to make out what the beadsman's job actually is, like what this guy is supposed to be?
So he prays for other people.
Yeah, exactly. He's a peasant that the family supports in order to live in the chapel and pray for their sins, right? So he's supposed to live a life of extreme self-denial, right? He sleeps in a cold chapel on a bed of ashes. He walks around barefoot in January and doesn't seem to do much except for pray. So he lives this life of self-denial so that they can go on indulging themselves, right? So we start with this scene of extreme cold and quiet and stillness, right? And then by stanza 3, we're starting to get hints of something else going on outside of the beadsman's chapel, right? Can I get somebody to start reading from Northward He Turneth?
Northward he turneth through a little door, scarce 3 steps, ere music's golden tongue. Flattered to tears this aged man implored, but no, already had his death bell rung. The joys of all his life were said and sung. His was harsh penance on St. Agnes' Eve. Another way he went, soon among rough ashes sat he for his soul's reprieve, and all night kept awake for sinners' sake to grieve.
So, what do you make of this description here of the beadsman's activities? Can we make connections between this and anything else in the poem? All right, well, let me ask you this. What is Madeline trying to do? What is she trying to induce in herself?
Vision like dream of it.
Yeah, she's trying to induce a dream, right? And in order to have a dream, what do you have to do?
Sleep.
You have to fall asleep, right? And what is the Beadsman going to be doing tonight?
Dying.
He will actually be dead at the end he will actually be dead at the end of the poem, right? Although the death here that's described is actually more figurative, right? His death bell has already rung because he basically has to behave as though he's already dead while alive, right? Earthly joys are not for him. He is not permitted to enjoy them. What else is he doing on St. Agnes Eve that presents a contrast to what Madeline is doing?
He's staying up all night to pray.
Yeah, he has to keep awake all night, right? So we have, young woman in search of pleasure who is able to sleep in her nice warm room, right? Whereas here we have an old man presented as a kind of contrast who has to stay awake. On a pile of rough ashes in a cold chapel. And we'll begin and end the poem with him. Now then when we get to stanza 4 here, right, can I get somebody to start reading from the ancient Beadsman heard the prelude soft?
That ancient Beadsman heard the prelude soft, and so it chanced from many a door was locked. From hurry to and from, soon up aloft, the silver snarling trumpets began to chime. The level chambers ready with their pride, were glowing to receive 1,000 guests, the carved angels ever eager-eyed, starred upon, whereupon their heads were poised rests, with hair blown back and wings put crosswise on their breasts.
Okay, thank you. So we're moving from this still, quiet, cold chapel to what? What's going on? Like, what's changing in this fourth stanza here as we move away from the Beadsman's perspective?
It's not quiet, there's music, and it's loud.
Yeah, we go from quiet to loud.
I would say there's light. You said how dark everything was.
Yeah,
It's
we go
cold,
from
and it's glowing.
we go from dark to light. From cold to warm. And let's also compare the carvings here at the end of this stanza to the carvings in the Beadsman's chapel. How are they different?
One's dead and one's alive.
Yeah, there's a sense of kind of stillness and stasis in the Beadsman's carvings, or the knights and ladies praying behind the black purgatorial rails, right? But the angels here, the carved angels, ever eager-eyed stared, where upon their heads the cornice rests, with hair blown back and wings put crosswise on their breasts, right? So they look like they're moving, right? So we're going from stillness to motion, although again, because they're carved angels, right? It's still only the illusion of motion. Right. These angels will always look like their hair is being blown will never be at rest. Just as the prayers being spoken by the knights and ladies in the chapel will never be heard. This is a pretty common motif in Keats. I think, did we talk about the Art of a Grecian Urn poem earlier in the semester? A little bit, maybe? Maybe not. Maybe that was in my other section. But yeah, he's talking about these images on an urn. And there are all of these actions that the figures on the urn are in the middle of that'll never be completed, right? So, like, for example, there's a young man, like, leaning down to kiss a young woman. And while she'll always be beautiful, she'll never age, he's also never going to finish that kiss, right? That relationship is never going to be consummated. And this is something that kind of runs through a lot of the imagery in the Oedipus and Agnes as well, even as Porphyro and Madeline do consummate the relationship and then run away. There's still a lot of this sense of the unfinished or the incomplete action. So let's talk here a little bit about this guy Porphyro. What is Porphyro like? What do we know about Porphyro? Is he supposed to be here? Absolutely 100% not, right? For one thing, he's definitely not supposed to be in Madeline's bedchamber. But why should he not even be in the castle?
He's from like a different family, kind of like Romeo and Juliet style.
Yeah,
and
and the families hate each other, right? So he is, the enemy of Madeline's family. And so this kindly old woman has to sneak him in. And I think there's something, if we look on page 963, stanza 12 there, where she's describing Porphyro's enemies who are present in the house. Can I get one of you to start reading from Get Hence, Get Hence?
Get hence, get hence, there's dwarfish Albrand. He had a fever late, and in the fit, he cursed thee and thine, both house and land. Then there's that old Lord Maurice, not a whit, more tame for his grey hairs, alas me, flit like a ghost away. Ah, gossip, dear, we're safe enough, here in this armchair sit, and tell me how, good saints, not here, follow me, child, or else these stones will be thy beer.
Okay, so a beer is a tune, right? And what does Angela tell Porphyro he should do right now? What should he be doing according to her? Given that his enemies are in the house, dwarfish Hildebrand and old Lord Morris, flit like a ghost away, right? So on the one hand, we have this, this permanent monumental structure, a tomb. But on the other, he's told to flit like a ghost, right? And a ghost, we know, is a kind of insubstantial being, right? Supposedly, you can just kind of put your hand right through it. But it's also a spirit of the dead. So let's just sit on that for a minute and go to the end of the poem, when they are escaping. can one of you read stanza 41 on page 970?
They glide like phantoms into the wide hall, like phantoms to the iron forge they glide. Where lay quarter in uneasy sprawl, with a huge empty flagon by his side. The wakeful bloodhound rose and shook his eye, but his sagacious eye in the oath. By one and one the bolts full easy slide. The chains lie silent on the footboard stones. The key turns and the door of one's hinges groans.
So we've got, like, at the beginning of the poem, right, this situation that is really kind of rooted in material reality, right? We've got, party, music, warmth, carvings, statues all over the place. But these statues only look like they're moving, or only look like they're doing things, right? And then here we have the opposite extreme, right? What are Madeline and Porphyro described as being like here at the end of the poem?
Phantom.
Yeah. And why do you think that matters? Why do you think it matters that they're like phantoms here? What does that make them in relation to everything else here?
They have to be phantoms in order to get out quietly, sneaky, almost as if they aren't even there.
I think we're thinking along the right lines here, right? How is a phantom essentially different from a statue? I mean, this, as I say that, it sounds like a stupid question, right? But it's
Not there.
yeah, it's something that is like, it's moving, right? But it's like it's just motion. It has no real physical presence. So you have these still things that look like they're moving, but have it's solid matter, right? Then you have these moving things, these things that are genuinely moving, but it's like they're not really there, right? They're ephemeral. And if we look at stanza 42 here, and they are gone, aye, ages long ago, these lovers fled away into the storm. That night the Baron dreamt of many a woe, and all his warrior guests with shade and form of witch and demon and large coffin worm were long to be nightmared. Angela the old died palsy-twitched, with meager face deformed. The Beadsman, after 1,000 aves told, for eye unsought, for slept among his ashes cold. So, what does this last stanza tell us about everyone who's been described in this poem? Where are they now?
Dead.
Yeah. Everyone. Madeline, Porphyro, the Baron, the Beadsman, Angela, everybody who is described in this poem is long dead, right? Everyone has died. And we end with the Beadsman dying after his prayers on his bed of ashes, right? Why do you think the poem does this?
Leaves us no room to make assumptions.
What's that?
It leaves us no room to make assumptions about the possibilities of the ending. Just cuts right to the chase. They all died.
But that makes it feel kind of anticlimactic, right? That,
Yeah.
Madeline and Porphyro, have made this daring escape. Porphyro hides in her closet. He sneaks into her bed. They have sex, they run away together, and then everyone's dead, right? And it all comes back to this poor old guy rolling around in the ashes praying a rosary.
So they died after they escaped from the castle?
Yeah, and apparently probably long after, right? So, you know, they go the way of all flesh eventually, right?
It might have something to do with, like, just Keats as, like, the writer, perhaps his style, when he knows he's dying, he might be, like, depressed about that, and it's like, he's transferring it over to his works, possibly.
Yeah. I think that this may actually have something to do with some of Keats's ideas, but I don't think it's necessarily autobiographical. I want to point you all to something in Keats's letters, which are given to us here. Look on page 1016, the letter to George and Thomas Keats. He mentions something on page 1017 that he calls negative capability. So can I get one of you to read for me the sentence that starts with "I mean negative capability" at the top of page 1017.
I mean negative capability. That is when man is capable of being in uncertainties, mysteries, doubts, without any irritable reaching after the fact to reason.
Okay, thank you. So let's just try to think about this for a minute. Right? What do we think this means? What do you think he means by negative capability here? How would you interpret this?
You're capable of negative, capable of being in uncertainties, mystery. I mean, normally when people say capabilities, they go, you're capable of this, you're capable of that. No one's being like, you're capable of doing horrible.
Okay.
I mean, I
Well,
would just say it would be like capable of something negative, I guess. I mean, I feel like that's in words itself.
I think you're about halfway there, but I think that you're interpreting the word negative here correctly, right? So I'm going to give you an example that might help you. Like, do you all know what the difference is between positive and negative freedoms? So positive freedoms are guaranteed freedoms to do a particular thing, right? Negative freedoms are freedoms from something being done to us. So positive freedoms are active, negative freedoms are passive, right? So say, like, you know, my right to practice or not practice any particular religion would be a positive freedom. My right to not have the government come into my house and search my crap without a warrant would be a negative freedom, right? I'm free from that particular kind of intrusion. So maybe if we think of negative capability in that same way, like if we think of positive capabilities, right? I think that this is kind of where you were halfway there, right? You know, is that a positive capability is your capacity to do something, right?
So the negative would be being like the capability of something bad not happening to you, like you being able to.
I think you're hung up on the bad part of it, right?
Yeah.
And I think that Keats only means passive by negative, right? So, if positive capability would be your capacity to do a thing, right? Then negative capability would be your capacity to not do something, right? And he actually kind of tells us here what he's saying negative capability is the capacity not to do, right? When we are faced with an unresolved question, right? What is our tendency? What do we usually want to do? For example, as I leave this question hanging in the air here, right?
Figure out the answer.
Yeah. Unanswered questions make us uncomfortable, right? Feeling like we don't know something makes us uncomfortable. Makes us fidgety. Right? We feel insecure. So what Keats describes as negative capability, right? Negative capability is essentially a level of comfort with uncertainty. Or with lack of closure. And this is arguably at the center of a lot of Keats's artistic practice, right? So Keats likes to give us these kinds of undecidable situations, right? Where we're not really sure exactly how we're supposed to feel about this, right? Are we supposed to admire the beauty of the figures on the urn? Are we supposed to pity them because they're just painted figures who can't complete an action? Right? How are we supposed to feel about Madeline and Porphyro's escape? Are we supposed to be happy for them? Or are we supposed to be sad or uncaring because everyone just died anyway, right? Because this was all so long ago. So when we find this kind of undecidability in a romantic poem, particularly a Keats poem, this is really kind of part of the design, right? It's part of the overall framework. Kind of just as Wordsworth tends to use that greater romantic lyric framework, right? Where poems that look like they're about nature are really about thought. This is kind of the central architecture of a lot of Keats's poetry. Now, there's one other thing that I do want to point us to before we run out of time that we haven't got to yet. What do you all think of the way Porphyro sneaks into Madeline's bedchamber and spies on her?
I mean, I think that's weird. I wouldn't like that
Yeah.
at all.
It certainly doesn't seem to post to fit the post Me Too moment, right?
Yeah. I mean, it feels like it could be socially acceptable because of the time that this feels like it's in. But at the same time, reading it now, it's I can't shake the fact that that is just not acceptable.
Yeah, that there's a dude hiding in her closet watching her
that's-
undress and get into bed,
Yeah.
and whose presence she's completely unaware of,
Right.
yeah. So there are two things at work here, right? One, and I think we see this in the medieval setting as well, right? We see the influence of the Gothic. Does anybody remember a Gothic text that we read that had a similar situation? Where someone sneaks into someone's home. Yeah. This is a lot like Ambrosio sneaking into Antonia's house in The Monk, right? Now, the polarity here is reversed a little bit, right, for a variety of reasons. So first off, what do we remember about the readership of Gothic novels? Who was the primary audience?
Females.
Yeah. Gothic novels were, for the most part, written for middle-class women. So, even in a text with a male villain like Ambrosio at the center of it, right? You see a lot of the action from the perspective of the female victim. the Romantic Gothic influence tends to reverse the polarity of this. And instead of the perspective of the, like instead of being put in the position of the female victim, the reader is usually put into the masculine position here, right? And that position is often kind of reoriented from aggressor or, victimizer, in Ambrosio's case, rapist, right? To charming rake or, attractive seducer, right? And one of the sources that I put on your bibliography here for today, it's the one that doesn't look like the others, the one that is not specifically about Keats or about this poem. Visual Pleasure in Narrative Cinema by Laura Mulvey. I put that on there for a specific reason. So in that essay, Mulvey defines what has become a really important concept in feminist criticism, which she calls the male gaze. So Mulvey is talking about visual arts, but the phenomenon she's describing here is the way shots in a film or kind of positioning in a painting tend to assume a male viewer who is looking at a female body for erotic pleasure, right? So, say like, the way an actress is shot in frames of a film, right? It's, the film is, the shot is almost always framed in such a way as to titillate a male viewer, right? So we can translate this from the visual arts to literature pretty easily when we get a physical description of a scene like kind of what we see on page 966. Right, so can we start here with stanza 24 and read up to stanza 26 here. Can somebody give us the casement high stanza?
A casement high and triple arched there was, all garlanded with carven imageries, of fruits and flowers and bunches of knotgrass, and diamonded with panes of quaint device, innumerable stains and splendid dyes, as are the tiger moth's deep damask wings, and in the midst 1,000 heraldries, and twilight saints and dim and
blazonings.
A shield
scutcheon is like a
Scutcheon.
family insignia. Yeah.
A shielded scutcheon blushed with blood of queens and kings.
All right, and can you read us the next stanza, Jordan?
Full on his casement shone the wintry moon, and threw warm golds on Madeline's fair breast. As down she knelt for heaven's grace and room, rose bloom fell on her hands together pressed, and on her silver cross soft amethyst, and on her hair a glory like a saint. She seemed a splendid angel, newly dressed. Save wings were heaven, Porphyro grew faint. She knelt, so pure a thing, so free from mortal taint.
Anon his heart revives, her vespers done, of all its wreathed pearls her hair she frees, unclasps her warm jewels one by one, loosens her fragrant bodice by degrees, her rich attire creeps rustling to her knees, half hidden like a mermaid in seaweed. Pensive awhile she dreams awake and sees in fancy fair St. Agnes in her bed, but dares not look behind or all the charm is fled. So let's look at the way this scene is framed. So we're put here in Porphyro's position, right? Watching Madeline. And what essentially is he observing here? Yeah, he's watching her get undressed, right? And say her prayers and get into bed. And she does not know that he's there. So what we have here is, this is kind of a classic male gaze example here, right? Where, we're supposed to be kind of sitting in that closet with Porphyro watching this. And, Porphyro is getting off on this. And we're mostly kind of finding it a little uncomfortable and strange. But I think it's like the reason I had you read the casement window part as well here, right, which doesn't seem to have anything directly to do with this, is that there's the stained glass window, right, that's shining a light onto Madeline. What do you notice about the color of the scene here? Like, what color is being shown onto Madeline's fair breast? Yeah, red, right? Warm gules, right? Right, the heraldic name for the color red. And at the end of the previous stanza, we've got a shielded scutcheon blushed with blood of queens and kings, right? So family emblems here, right? But also kind of like a reference to family violence. And the other thing I think that the whole warm gules thing, or the whole idea of warm red is pointing to as well, is that there is a kind of ambiguous treatment of Madeline in the poem, right, as both innocent virgin and potential danger. Like, for example, what does he describe her as on stanza 26 when she's half hidden?
Mermaid.
Yeah, like a mermaid in seaweed, right? So what do we know about mermaids? Do we know anything about mermaids?
It depends.
Okay.
Sometimes, some mermaids, wear clothes, coconut shell bra, and others don't.
Uh-huh.
So they're mystical.
Uh-huh.
Pretty.
The thing I particularly love about the mermaid legend is that it apparently comes from sailors seeing manatees at an extreme distance, and also probably being a little bit drunk. But so what did mermaids do to sailors?
They sing them, put them in like a trance, like a
Yeah,
seduction.
they sing them down into the depths, right? They sing to them and lure, and try to, encourage them to jump off the ship and join them, right? So yeah, so mermaids use their wiles to drown sailors. So I think this kind of coupled with the kind of image of warm blood, and on the previous page, 965, and page stanza 19, right? Never on such a night have lovers met, since Merlin paid his demon all the monstrous debt. So that's a reference to the sorceress Vivian seducing the wizard Merlin and then trapping him in a cave, right? So there are all of these kind of ambivalent danger markers here for Porphyro that are related not to Madeline's family necessarily, but to Madeline herself as something dangerous. So, just kind of one more kind of ambiguous thing that the poem leaves open here. We're about out of time. Do either of you have any questions about any of this? Okay, cool. So let me give you the reading questions from Mary Shelley. And when we come back on Wednesday, we will talk about romantic era science fiction.